Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Resist online findings launch for our first findings, where we will be exploring mapping anti-gender politics. Just to say, Resist is an EU-funded project and part of the Feminism and Democracy call. And today we will be presenting a series of findings. The outline of today will be that we will have an introduction to Resist and Work Package 1, which is our mapping work package. We will then go through each section of the findings, which are the transnational findings, then the Swiss findings, Polish, then Hungary, then UK, then the European Parliament. We'll have time for a short question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A box. We will answer what we can at that stage. Thank you very, very much for coming today. And if you want to find out more, we have an extensive findings reports that are located on our website, and we will give the full details at the end of the webinar. We're also recording this webinar, and we hope to put that on our website in the near future as well. Thank you very much, and I'll pass to Gavin Titley.
Thank you very much, Kath. Sorry there for the slight technical hitch with the video. It's very nice to be with you, even if, of course, we can't see you, but to present some of the findings to you on behalf of the research team that have worked together over the last 18 months in this first stage of the Resist project, mapping anti-gender politics. The aim of this work package has been to map and analyze formations of anti-gender politics as forces that we say unequivocally imperil equality, gender freedom, and sexual diversity in contemporary Europe. And that this is a very serious threat can be seen by the range of actors across Europe that are animated through their opposition to the very idea of gender itself. At the same time, the very extent of this animation poses some kind of complex problems for research. It presents us with a political landscape that is marked by differences between groups and movements, as well as similarities, and that they're united by networks of ideological exchange and sometimes just affinity that are significant, but as many of you out there will know, are also fluid and mutable. They're changing often. So for that reason, Work Package 1 departed from a kind of range of considerations. We set out to account for the specificity of anti-gender politics in a number of contexts, while also mapping and understanding transnational processes of exchange and mobilization between different actors. We set out to examine actors and tactics, while also being careful not to assume that anti-gender politics is the exclusive preserve of the radical or nationalist right, though of course it's a key animating obsession and theme, and therefore needing also to be attentive to different ideological and cultural affinities and connections, especially as these are produced in one of the themes that runs through our research is that these are produced and these are transformed in often highly mediated political contexts. So this background thinking is expressed in the research questions that you see on the screen in front of you. And I'm not going to read through them now, other than to draw attention to one dimension of it in research question 1.2, where we emphasize not just looking at how representations circulate beyond politics and political discourse and media culture, but we also paid attention to strategies of controversy generation. And this was an intuition that we had at the start of the project. And it's one that I think has proved useful, as one of the things that we see in these results is that the production and staging of controversies emerges as a key anti-gender political tactic and way of occupying public and political space again and again. And this is something which is intensified by the degree of mediated politics that supports anti-gender politics in the first place. Just some brief background to the context and approach to the research. To focus on the production and circulation of anti-gender politics, we had to decide which contexts to focus on and also how to interrelate them with each other. We commenced with an exploratory study of anti-gender politics in the European Parliament. Initially, if you like, as a way of taking stock of what is happening with anti-gender politics, but also realizing that the European Parliament is a very particular arena for the prosecution of this politics. And Dr. Cheryl Lynch will present findings from this study subsequently. Following this, we conducted 4 national case studies, chosen for the acute nature of anti-gender politics in each context, but also because we wanted to use this case study selection to clearly challenge the assumption that anti-gender politics is primarily or exclusively located in the east of Europe, imagined as a traditionalist and a liberal space in comparison to the inverted commas progressive West. Thus, Hungary and Poland, well-established sites of anti-gender politics, but what was interesting for us is to think about what is happening now and what is being sustained and how. The United Kingdom was selected for the particularity of the post-Brexit political climate and the centrality, as we'll see in the results, of the anti-trans politics in contemporary Britain. And Switzerland was chosen for a number of reasons, among them as a case study in cultural and linguistic travel, where discourses from Germany and France circulate, but it was of interest to us to think about how they're taken up or adapted, and of course also opposed. As a general approach, in each case study, there was 3 stages, or there was a number of approaches in each case study that was common to each case study. We were trying to look at anti-gender politics as furthered by movements, but also to think of it in some ways as beyond movements, as a set of political repertoires that can be taken up in a number of different ways, particularly within, as I've mentioned, a mediated context. We were looking for ways of researching anti-gender politics in a way that would allow for a kind of general thematic compatibility across contexts, while also finding ways of course, accounting for their contextual particularity. And as many of you out there will know, this is, of course, a very tricky dimension of comparative research before we even think about the transnational elements of that research. Each study was designed to move sequentially from looking at parliamentary debate first to then looking at media discourse, and from this moving on to a stage of what we call controversy mapping. So the parliamentary data and the media data would also inform this. Controversy mapping is a technique which originates in science and technology studies and gives us a way of attempting to map the range of positions, actors, and relations that shape debates and controversies and conflicts as they play out in public, without assuming that there are simply pro or anti positions, and that we can break down controversies or conflicts just into those kinds of camps. Methodologically, we defined, in order to be able to work across these contexts and to work across these different areas of research, we defined 5 thematic clusters, which you can see on the screen there. The idea of this framework of thematic clusters was that it was designed, first of all, from our initial reading, our pilot reading of what was happening in each context, from a literature review of what was happening in each context, and an initial review of the parliamentary data in each context. So the idea of these clusters was to allow us to have cross case study analysis, while also allowing the research teams that you'll hear from a little later to select the political issues that were most keenly contested in their context over the period of 2015 to 22. The general methodology then, in parliamentary debates, we selected at least 25 debates minimum per national parliament from the relevant databases, and we coded key quotes and logged the actors involved in anti-gender politics in each case. In the media analysis, we selected at least 3 newspapers analysed per country, and what we looked for there was the different ways in which they treated the highly contested and loaded notion of gender ideology, both in their news coverage and also in their opinion and editorial publication. And then finally, we moved to a stage of controversy mapping, where we chose 1 controversy per national case study and mapped it, first of all, by working out a factual narrative, a temporal narrative of the controversy, and then moving from an analysis of opinion pieces to using different kinds of network software to map the different actors and the relations between them who are active in these controversies. So this is an overview so far, obviously, of the methodology and the approach. It's a long and slow scene setting start, but allow me to move from there and fast forward to something more dramatic, perhaps, which is the transnational set of findings that we developed based on a comparative analysis of the national case studies and their findings that you're going to hear from subsequently. So this is the synthetic work that we have done on the basis of the national case studies, which we'll work our way through in the rest of this presentation. The first question we asked ourselves in looking across the findings was, what emerges as anti-gender politics in our study, and what is the focus of this politics? The first dimension of this that I'd like to emphasize is an intensification in the idea or in the contention that it's the very notion of gender which is a threat to a range of different things. That is, there's a clear, almost idealist orientation rather, which is being articulated, that it is the idea, the concept, and its circulation that is doing the damage. And in many instances, of course, what this does tactically, remembering our focus on tactics, is it legitimates a splitting. Anti-gender actors say we only oppose the concept, not necessarily the people and identities associated with it, while nevertheless, of course, using this opposition to the concept or to just the idea to substantively oppose LGBTIQ plus rights and women's rights and autonomy. A key articulation of this that we saw across case studies is a renewed focus on protecting children, or being seen to need to protect children from gender ideology, or sometimes LGBTIQ plus ideology. Sometimes this varies in the way that it's expressed. A move which does a number of things. It, of course, always legitimates a certain kind of moral fervor when one is defending children and therefore defending innocence. But what we noticed is that it also produces expanded sites of contention. All forms of education, schools, libraries, youth services, counselling, and health can become sites of controversy generation, or can become sites of anti-gender mobilization. It also, and I think this is one of our darkest findings, legitimates in some contexts increasing forms of conflation of the very fact of LGBTIQ plus identities with the risk of sexualizing or even abusing children. At the same time, within this, while the coordinates of family, faith, and nation are central, of course, as we know, historically to anti-gender mobilizations, it's very noticeable that a language of freedom, democracy, and sovereignty is very pronounced in the way in which this politics is articulated and prosecuted, particularly in the language of freedom of speech, which I'm sure everybody has come across at this point, but also in the articulation of rights, that is in appealing to forms of rights that do not have a given status in law, particularly ideas of parents' rights or the right to a father or women's rights, but which are articulated as natural but marginalized categories of rights which need to be struggled for. One of those striking findings in our study is the extent to which political and media debates about transgender rights and trans people and trans identities have been produced over the last few years. And again, this will not come as a surprise to many people here. While this varies somewhat in the parliamentary data, in the media data, the extent and the intensification of this is striking. In a relatively short period of time, what we term a hostile hypervisibility of trans people has been produced, and in some instances pushed to the center of political and public debate. Moreover, our data mapping demonstrates that this intensification and amplification is not just relatively new, but it is also the product of concerted and tactical political action. For example, a pattern noticeable across all the contexts studied is the role of major centre-right or conservative right newspapers in ramping up a so-called trans debate as both a political and ideological commitment, but also as a commercial strategy. And further, in so doing, what they do is give a significant platform to certain campaign groups, while of course excluding others. And this accords with a very clear agenda setting role on this question. This has to be immediately contrasted with a dominant transnational media and political frame for representing trans identities, which we see both in Parliament and media, which is the contention, the very strident contention, that transness is a product of ideological indoctrination. We see trans people presented or framed as presumed vulnerable, and this constant reference to the immaturity of young trans people. And there's the frequent projection of a trans lobby that is involved in imposing this project on, of course, otherwise given and settled nations. It's worth noting here that one of the many findings in this stage of our research that frames civil society and associations and services as unrepresentative ideological agents and thus somehow undemocratic, it's a pronounced pattern in our findings that this attack on civil society as undemocratic activism not only furthers the conspiratorial idea of gender ideology, but it's also important to note that this fuels a wider anti-democratic backlash against participative politics, protest, and activism, which I think many of us can see, of course, taking shape internationally. In the second of two categories for presenting these transnational findings, I'd like to look at the question of who are those promoting and perpetuating anti-gender politics as they emerge in our data. It's not surprising, of course, for many reasons, that hostility to gender, feminism, and LGBTIQ plus rights and identities is primarily associated with men in the conservative and radical extreme right in Europe. What this also does is it confirms the extent to which speaking for women and for women's rights is an integral political strategy of these sectors. The exception here, as we'll see subsequently, or the only exception that we find to this, is in the European Parliament. As noted at the outset in our starting orientations, it's also worth underlining that it is reductive to understand anti-gender politics, though, as solely the product of the radical right of conservative politics. The centrality of anti-trans mobilization, which I just mentioned, is the main site in which alliances between often very different political orientations emerge, and we'll see different examples of that in the case studies. These three findings, these next three findings, relate to the centrality of media, which is something which has been very central to our findings. Of course, this is a tricky issue. We did center media methodologically right from the start. So what does it mean, having put media at the center, to find that media are central agents in anti-gender politics? Well, one important dimension of this finding is that media activity in this space goes beyond discursive activity. Say, it is more than just reproducing news frames that advance anti-gender ideology, though we see plenty of that too. It also constitutes forms of active intervention, naturalizing gender ideology, hugely increasing coverage of an issue in ways that constitute a clear distortion of news values, and actively providing and denying platforms to differentiated groups constitutes a form of media activism, which is, I think, a very important dimension of contemporary anti-gender politics. Finally, I'd like to look at how is anti-gender politics retaining its momentum? How are visions of the problem, risks, and threats sustained? Because we were very conscious in this project that we were entering into looking at anti-gender politics at a very key and particular moment, and on the basis of so much good work which has been done on this issue in the past. So it was very important to us to look at what is actually, if you like, working now, what is giving it some kind of momentum, and how are these visions of what is at stake, or what the threat, the problems, risks, and threats, what are they seen to be at this moment in time? The first of these findings is that gender ideology is infinitely adaptable as a notion, and it changes by context and over time. And this slipperiness, or this often vagueness, or this expansiveness is key to advancing anti-gender politics. It's a tactical and strategic strength. It means that interchanging issues can be dismissed or diminished through their association with the term. For all of that, there are also some very key and hardened ways in which the idea of anti-gender ideology is used. The first, or sorry, gender ideology is used. The first is the idea of the imposition of gender ideology as emanating from outside the nation and imported through a variety of non-representative agencies. This is obviously an established trope in anti-gender politics, but it is one that has strengthened and intensified quite noticeably. Related to this idea that gender is being imported from outside of the nation through a variety of agencies which might be participative, but because they are in this narrow sense non-representative, they can be painted as anti-democratic. A key related dimension of this is that anti-gender politics presents LGBTIQ plus movements as dogmatic and often as authoritarian, and therefore as, if you like, the domestic agents involved in imposing gender ideology on unwilling populations. And this is the way that they themselves then are positioned as being also anti-democratic. And of course, a part of this is a very key and established political move, but one which is also replete in the data, that anti-gender actors claim consistently to be silenced. Anti-gender claims that the silencing of anti-gender actors is key to driving the targeting of those they oppose as unrepresentative, ideological, and excessive in their activism. So in other words, they're simply defending democracy by acting, often presenting themselves as reluctant reluctant political actors who simply have to get involved in the issue because they have no choice. So in summary then of our transnational findings, which we will work through in different ways and what's to follow, the research found an animated anti-gender political landscape characterized, as I've tried to lay out, by ideological agitation, but also political opportunism. There are pronounced and steady fixations, but there is also an increasingly fluid focus on often interchangeable targets and issues. We see this in the way in which gender ideology can come to encompass almost anything. So there are clear continuities in the targeting of equality and gender and sexual diversity, but these intersect with and are being transformed by what we see as an emerging repertoire of discourses and practices. Thank you for your attention, and I will pass over to my colleague Katja for the first of the national case studies.
Thank you, Gavin, and good afternoon, everyone. Here is Ekaterina Philip from the University of Fribourg. And in the following slides, I will introduce some of the key findings pertaining specifically to the Swiss national case study. So we'll start with a very brief introduction into the context. The data collection period for this study included from 2018 until 2023. And this period is characterized by several important legislative changes which took place in Switzerland in the area of gender equality. So in 2018, for example, the Swiss Parliament adopted the proposal to extend the anti-racism article in the criminal code to include a ban on discrimination based on sexual orientation, the so-called Article 261 bis. But through the optional referendum, then the vote was held, and in February 2020, the Swiss voters finally endorsed a proposed amendment. Then in December 2020, the Swiss federal government approved the opening of civil marriage and adoption rights for same-sex couples, but then once again, the referendum was launched, and in 2021, the Swiss electorate voted in favor of allowing marriage rights for all. Since January 2022, transgender persons or persons with a gender variance can change their official gender record and first name quickly and without bureaucratic complications. But also in 2022, the Swiss government contested the introduction of a third gender option or no gender option for official record. And the statement on the government website announced that the social conditions for the introduction of a third gender or for a gender waiver do not currently exist in the Swiss society. So political debates pertaining to these legal changes were, of course, included in the corpus of our parliamentary data analysis. However, we also considered a range of other relevant debates. And I would like to present some of the key findings which emerged from the analysis of the parliamentary data. Well, one of the first and probably striking findings is that the contestation of gender and sexual equalities is often articulated through technocratic, legalistic, or procedural discourses in Switzerland. We have seen that the majority of contributions that oppose or criticize gender and sexual equalities in Switzerland are mostly made by Swiss People's Party. It is slightly more than 66%, followed by the Centre and then EDU. Despite this far-right dominance, openly hostile or inflammatory comments are quite rare in the Swiss parliamentary discourse compared to procedural, legalistic, or other objections. For example, in the debate on simplifying procedure for changing the registered gender, some MPs voiced concern with regard to what this legal change would cause to the system with regard to the possible abuse of the pension age or military service. Or when it concerned, for example, including gender identity in certain laws, arguments were brought that it would cause a multiplicity of problems to the legal system or possibly even require changes to the constitution. And what this finding shows is that the opposition to gender and sexual equalities, like in the case of Switzerland, does not always have to come in the form of emotionally charged or pronounced ideological discourses. Another finding is that an essentialist view on sex as a biological category is a consistent reference in debates. Very often, MPs across political spectrum would use evidence from medical sciences, and some polemic statements would make references to gender ideology and then call on the unscientific departure of the understanding of biological sex in the so-called gender ideology. Once again, another finding is about the vulnerable child, or the figure of the vulnerable child that must be protected against the sexualization. And this argument is deployed to oppose the legitimacy of non-normative gender and sexual identities. Like in other case studies, yes, this is one of the central argument. An example of this is, although, for example, the Swiss parliament does not deal with questions related to school curricula, because the school curricula falls under the responsibility of the cantons, sex education is nevertheless a clear target of mobilization in relation to publicly funded national sexual health and sex education campaigns. Educational programs such as, for example, drag queen reading hours or national sex education campaigns are criticized as immoral and dangerous if they educate children about sexualities and queer identity. Gender-affirming care is also positioned as a threat to minors, and this further enhances the focus on the figure of the vulnerable child. We have encountered voices in the Swiss parliament that make references to an exponential increase in young people seeking medical gender reassignment. It is argued that young people are animated or encouraged to transition by the medical or sometimes educational establishments. And often also the Swiss government is criticized for lagging behind other countries, sometimes compared to Finland. So the countries which have already recognized the dangers of gender-affirming care and have reacted appropriately with bans and mandatory psychotherapy. Children's rights are further mobilized to justify opposition to lesbian couples' access to assisted reproductive technologies. It is argued that children have a right to be raised by their biological parents, and this type of argument suggests that biological connection is necessary for the well-being of children and that queer families deny children of this right. And then the last point is that our intersectional examination of data illustrated that gender inequalities and increase in domestic violence in Switzerland were disproportionately associated in the Swiss parliamentary discourse with Muslim minorities. Some MPs from the Swiss People's Party and the Center sought to table debates about the child's headscarf. Also, there were arguments made about migrant women trying to manipulate the asylum process by giving birth to children, or some asylum seekers using the transitioning as a way to get asylum or to facilitate asylum process. So on the next slide, I will present some of the findings pertaining to the media analysis. And first of all, I would say that we have selected for this study 5 newspapers that cover the conventional political spectrum. So for the Swiss-German case study, we have chosen Die Weltwoche, which is a right-wing oriented weekly magazine, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is an established center-right daily, WOS Wochenzeitung as a left-wing Swiss-German language liberal weekly newspaper. And for the French part, we included Le Temps, La Tribune de Genève, and additionally, we looked at 20 Minutes and 20 Minutes Romandie. And I will present only 3 findings which stand out from this study. So first of all, the French gender ideology in both its German and French spelling variants appeared significantly more frequently in the selected German language press than in the French language press. So the German language right-wing newspaper Die Weltwoche has the highest number of articles in our sample, more than 40% in our corpus. And given the wide circulation of the term gender ideology in the German language phrase, it appears as if the term has already established itself as a recognizable and legitimized concept in the German-speaking Switzerland. Comparatively, in the French-speaking Swiss media, the concept is used significantly less frequently and mostly as a polemical expression. théorie du genre is used to convey a similar but a less controversial meaning. What we also found is that the media discourse is key to situating gender ideology as a presumed problem in Switzerland. In the majority of cases, the term is used without quotation marks, without definition being provided. It presents gender ideology as an uncontroversial concept, as if it already has a status of coherence as an ideology, which should be understandable for readers. At the same time, the concept presents some fluidity in its definition, which allows the term to adopt and morph and move. What we also found is that in the right-wing press, the idea of gender ideology is presented as a threat to the freedom of speech. It is often associated with canceling and silencing discourses, particularly in the context of trans and LGBTIQ activism. It is accused of shutting down debate about women's rights and the status of biological sex. Must be noted, however, that in contrast in the left-wing press, the term is predominantly associated with the increase in far-right activism. In the French-speaking part of the country, trans issues are frequently spoken about in terms of an activist minority trying to silence the majority, or also about in context of importation of cancel culture into Switzerland. For the last slide, I will just mention that for the Swiss controversy, we have selected two events, both unfolded in 2022. One in the German and one in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. So for the German part of Switzerland, we have looked at the media coverage of the drag storytime event, which took place in Zurich, Tanzhaus, but was violently interrupted in October 2022 by a young neo-Nazi group. And for the French-Swiss case study, we have selected a media coverage of the cancellation of two transphobic talks at the University of Geneva. Both controversies show that there is a clear political aim to create controversies over gender. What the Swiss case showed on the drag story time interruption by the neo-Nazis, and on the slide you can see a few screenshots from their website, but also from the Twitter account, where gender ideology is clearly positioned as one of the main threats by the right-wing extremist group Junge Tat. But basically, some of the key findings related to this controversy is that the issues related to children are appropriated by diverse actors as a strategy to engage public in anti-gender politics. We have seen how right-wing and conservative media capitalized on the event. And the second main finding is that right-wing extremists gain momentum by appropriating the topic of gender. Just because the topic has been popularized so widely in the right-wing media discourse, it enabled the right-wing extremists to join the debate and say, we are basically saying what the others are saying. And I will finish with this and pass the floor to my colleague, Roberto Ulpa.
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks again for coming. I'll very briefly walk you through the main findings of the Polish case. A few words of the context. The period of examination started in 2015 and ended in 2023. It encompasses 2 terms of office of Polish Sejm, that is the lower chamber of the parliament. That period was dominated by the continuous populist, nationalist, right-wing government led by Law and Justice Party with a range of other groups on the spectrum of right to far right. There are some anti-discrimination regulations in place in Poland. However, there are no regulations concerning, for example, same-sex couples. And in the given period, there were also already tough anti-abortion laws were even further put stringent. In terms of feminist and LGBT organizations, there is a thriving third sector community. There is also emergent trans and queer groups and movements that we've observed in the last several years. And we also have observed the emergent non-metropolitan mobilizations outside of the big cities into the smaller provincial towns and villages and locations. In terms of the data set, a part of the 30 parliamentary debates from the mentioned period of time, we have examined over 280 articles from Rzeczpospolita, which is a little bit more conservative leaning, and Gazeta Wyborcza, which is more liberal dailies. And additionally, we have also looked into Super Express, which is one of the main tabloids, and Do Rzeczy, which served as our case study of the right-wing or far right-wing media outlet. As our controversy case, we have chosen to work with arresting of Margot, a non-binary queer activist from Stop Bzdurom collective, and ensuing upheavals. So now, in terms of the main parliamentary findings, what we've observed is that there is a significant amount of instances that can be labeled as anti-gender. However, it is a very small core group of repeatedly the same people who engage and re-engage in fueling the discourse in political debates. The discourse is highly emotive and uses very offensive rhetorics, forcing defensive positions from the left and liberal actors, and it precludes actual debate or possibility of rational argumentation in many cases. What has already been mentioned by Gavan or Katja, we have also observed a very strong, flexible functioning of anti-gender discourse in Poland, showing extensive interoperability between used issues, rhetorics, keywords among anti-gender actors. And this, we conclude, allows the flexible maneuvering field that can mobilize anti-gender strategies according to the needs of those actors. And finally, the core thematic trope that we observed in parliamentary debates can be grouped along three main pillars, one concerning paternalistic protectionism narratives, the other one speaking to the defensiveness against imaginary threats, and then finally certain, perhaps perplexing or not so, coexistence of the religious and pseudoscientific biologist arguments. Now, moving to the media findings, Gazeta Wyborcza and Rzeczpospolita, framed as liberal and conservative media outlets, do not show significantly divergent attitudes, and both are quite adverse to engaging and promoting anti-gender narratives. And this perhaps stands in the little contrast to other country cases where the liberal and conservative media outlets tend to engage with those narratives quite differently. Then anti-gender discourse again is concentrated around very few repeatedly engaging actors, and that voice their opinions in media, as also we observed in the parliamentary case. And the far right-wing Do Rzeczy media outlet serves as a strong supporter and hub media outlet, giving voice to those narratives. And the third observation worth mentioning in terms of media findings is that there is a very strongly pronounced international dimension in thinking about anti-gender mobilizations. Very frequently, different global anti-gender actors are being mentioned as either figures of admiration by the anti-gender actors or figures of condemnation within the liberal discourse. And equally, EU stands very frequently as a threat to the national sovereignty or as a beacon of hope for the liberally minded media outlet. And now, on my last slide, in terms of controversy mapping findings, we see certain synergy and of the similar observations with the media and parliamentary findings. But before, one notable observation here is that we saw an intensified involvement of the state and government offices, notably police, prosecutor general, Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Justice, in spinning and engaging directly in anti-gender agenda at the pretext of arresting Margot and other queer activists. This event has also mobilized a public debate around Polish language and grammatical difficulties of addressing non-binary and trans people's lives and ability to speak meaningfully about them due to certain grammatical constraints of the language. And this was welcomed addition that broadened feminist efforts to reintroduce and engage in debates about the feminitives in language. And final observation from this stage of mapping is that there is a strong synergetic resource boosting among anti-gender actors and groups due to their intra-group cooperations and exchanges. For example, many organizations share the office locations, or the same people sit on the boards of allied but distinct organizations. So thank you from me, and now passing over to my colleague, Katja again, who will present Hungary.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Yes, this is Katerina Filip again, and I will continue with presenting the some of the key findings for Hungary. We will start with the brief introduction into the context. Once again, the data collection period was 2018 to 2023. And a few words on the situation with relation to gender equality in Hungary. So we all know that Hungarian government's anti-gender politics has attracted significant political and academic attention. And although the right-wing conservative Fidesz party has been in power since 2010, existing scholarship shows that the intensification of anti-gender politics relates to party and government's opposition to the Istanbul Convention, as well as the de-accreditation of gender studies MA programs, which date pretty much back to 2017. And scholarship further argues that such intensification of anti-gender discourse was a conscious and strategic instrumentalization of the topic by Fidesz aimed at strengthening its political position. Most recently, the Hungarian government passed several restrictive laws in the realm of gender equality. So in May 2020, it limited transgender rights by banning legal gender reassignment. In February 2021, it banned the adoption of children by same-sex couples. In June 2021, the Child Protection Law came into force, which prohibited the exposure of minors to LGBTIQ+ related content. So I will present some of the findings pertaining to the parliamentary debates that we have collected for this period. And one of the first things that stood out to us was that it was a consistent feature of anti-gender discourse that those who are advocating for LGBTIQ+ rights are cast by the government as a danger to society because they promote particular policies. So rights advocates are regularly accused of threatening children, threatening to spoil children and harm heteronormative families and through indoctrination. And this becomes particularly evident in considerations of the Child Protection Law. Because given the importance of civic activism in opposing the law, it became probably particularly important to delegitimize civil society in parliamentary debates. Furthermore, LGBTIQ and trans individuals and activists are delegitimized through a purposeful conflation of issues and arguments. we have seen that on multiple occasions that Hungarian conservative MPs would conflate LGBTIQ plus issues with a topic of pedophilia. And it was even sometimes that we saw the LGBTIQ abbreviation would end with P, suggesting that pedophilia is one of the words to be included in it. And it is seen as a way to attack the LGBT plus people, but also to attack the civil society and activity. Moreover, it is a regular feature of parliamentary discourse that MPs from Fidesz seek to present their arguments through the language of rights and freedoms. So, for example, the exclusion of civil society is framed as a question of protecting rights and democracy. The exclusion of NGOs, including LGBTIQ plus groups, from collaborating with schools on educational programs, and the prohibition of sex education in schools is framed as a parental right, which means that parents have the right to educate their children on sexuality and the way they want, and also that the child has the right, whatever it means, to the right to be identified based on their biological sex. Another point is quite interesting, but attacking gender studies as a discipline no longer emerges as a central tactic in Hungarian politics. And probably given the de-accreditation of the two gender studies MA programs that existed in Hungary, this point is no longer relevant. The critique of theoretical work on gender, however, still remains a viable tactic, and it is routinely discredited as ideologically based pseudoscience or as serving political agendas. Another point is that mentions of trans people in the corpus of the debates that we collected occurs predominantly after 2020, and this has probably several reasons behind it. One being that prior to 2020, there was never an official ruling on gender recognition in Hungary. But then in 2020, the Hungarian government passed a law that eliminated the possibility for trans, non-binary, or intersex individuals to undergo legal gender reassignment. Then after 2021, trans people, aside from occasional solidarity expressed by the opposition, appear in parliamentary discourse predominantly in association with the dangers of sex education. They are described as wanting to corrupt Hungarian children. And this was once again probably linked to the introduction of the child protection law. Another theme or discursive strategy is the threat from George Soros and foreign-funded NGOs, which still remains a common narrative. So they are accused of interfering into Hungary's internal affairs and using financial resources to influence Hungarian politics. And the EU and the West is manifested as a threat, mostly in response to EU's criticism of Hungary's approach to democratic values. Further, I would like to present some of the findings from the Hungarian media sample. We had to reduce the Hungarian media sample a little bit because when we searched for 5 years, the amount of material was so large that it was almost impossible for us to process it. Therefore, the sample was from 20 to 23. And it consisted of 3 news outlets positioned differently on the political spectrum. So Magyar Hírlap was chosen as a right-wing outlet, strongly attached to the Fidesz political party. Válasz Online was selected as a reliably centrist media outlet, and then Telex HU as a liberal progressive media source. And some of the key findings is, one of the most obvious was that there is a significant alignment between anti-gender discourse in parliament and in the government media. So Magyar Hírlap as a pro-government media channel mostly amplifies the views of the government. When it was still in print, for example, it allocated the front pages to politicians campaigning on anti-gender issues. And it is very critical on many gender and sexuality related topics. Furthermore, Magyar Hírlap as a pro-government newspaper is openly hostile towards trans people. This is evident in the usage of transphobic language, the recycling of transphobic news, and the provision of platforms to trans-exclusionary campaigners. Occasionally, they would express limited empathy in relation to trans people, as well as in relation to homosexual people. But this is usually expressed through the sentiment that a good homosexual is someone who is silent and invisible and lives this experience in the confines of one's home. The next finding is that the idea of gender ideology is constantly invoked as a threat to national values, but its emphasis shifts. So Magyar Lab offers interestingly many definitions of gender ideology. And this is different because when I presented the Swiss findings, I mentioned that gender ideology is hardly ever mentioned. So in the Hungarian right-wing media, it is mentioned quite frequently. First mentions started to appear, or definitions are given quite frequently. It appeared first in 2010, then disappeared somewhat, and then reappeared, re-emerged with new force in 2017. And some definitions compared gender ideology to immigration as one of the most serious threats to the European Union, while others presented as an extremist ideology or a tool of a globalist power. And probably last, but also quite interesting finding that Valas Online and Telex HU, although both newspapers are often quite consciously critical, assume critical position on conservative or right-wing interpretations of gender and sexuality related issues, they explain a noticeable hesitancy to openly criticize transphobic views. So, and I will conclude with some of the observations related to the controversy mapping. And for the Hungarian controversy, we have selected the media coverage of the events related to the child protection law, because this controversy was characterized by overall significant high-level tactical investment. There were legal actions such as imposition of fines on bookstores and NGOs. There was a referendum on the child protection, organized around the child protection law with a list of misleading questions. There was a great deal of investment in publicity, such as the billboard, like the one you can see on the slide, calling to protect children. And the only tactic that probably failed was the referendum itself, because due to the efforts of civil society, it was invalidated. So what emerged from analysis of this controversy is that anti-gender narratives often adopt to nationalistic frames, represented as a struggle of values and ideas between Hungary and the West, EU, which is particularly visible when Hungary is depicted as defending its national values, earlier against communists, and now currently against Brussels, against EU, West, George Soros, the elites. Furthermore, undermining sexual and gender freedoms is framed as the protection of families and children. So the children and family framework allows both political and media actors to argue that the goal of the law is not to discriminate against LGBTIQ+ people, but to protect children from harmful impact of gender or occasionally a transgender ideology. And one more finding is that drawing on the language of rights and social protection is a key element in anti-gender actors' attempt to strengthen the legitimacy of their arguments. For example, when LGBTQ+ inclusive sex education and affirmative care of trans children is described as experimenting on children, the language of rights is mobilized to protect children and emphasize the responsibility of adults in protecting children. Therefore, when children's well-being is presented as being at stake, the discriminatory policies and practices can be justified. And this was the last finding for the Hungarian case study, and I'll pass further to Gavin.
Thank you, Katja, and hello again, everybody. I will briefly present findings from the UK case study. If you recall, in my original presentation, we talked about the range of thematic areas where we went looking for the manifestation of anti-gender tactics and strategies. And one of the striking things about this case study, that of the United Kingdom, is that it is really only in and around trans rights that we found anti-gender material in the sampling and in the research that we did. And I think that that is not something that will come as a big surprise to many people who are familiar with the political debate and the context at the moment. We looked at quite a lot of sources in the UK context, all of the sources which have been mentioned previously in terms of debates from the Parliament, the House of Commons in this instance, from the three conventional newspapers on the conventional political spectrum, in this instance, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and The Scotsman. And we also collected a lot of material for reasons that I'll go into from other media sources and op-eds from a range of other sources as well during the debate on the Gender Recognition Scotland Bill, which was the controversy which we studied. And what we see in this and across these, if I can get the slides to work. Yes, thank you. When we come first of all to Parliament, we can see a pattern in Parliament which is also replicated in media coverage, where, of course, in media coverage it is intensified and sensationalized in ways that we don't see in Parliament. It is very rare to see in the House of Commons fiery or inflammatory rhetoric of any kind. But what we can see very, very clearly is that a pronounced anti-trans politics has taken shape during the period of the current Conservative government. In fact, there's a very marked shift from a discourse of relative concern in 2015-16 to very overt problematization from 2021 onwards. In other words, in the aftermath of 2018 and opening up the Gender Recognition Act for consultation. What we did in looking at Parliament was to code the different ways in which transness is discussed and the ways in which it is problematized. And one of the ways, which is, or the way in which this is done most frequently and most intensely in the UK Parliament, is actually to present trans people, not just to delegitimize their lives, but to frame them as a consequence, as in need of paternalistic protection. The most overt form of delegitimization is to consistently present transgender identity as an ideology or a lifestyle trend, or as caused by some kind of external influencing agent, everything from social media to the work of the so-called trans lobby and so on and so forth. So this is often done, or this is often also furthered through the use of what if scenarios. So it's very noticeable in the parliamentary data that rather than talking about actual cases or actual experiences, there's a reliance on and there's a centrality accorded to what if scenarios, rhetorical scenarios that say, what if this was to be, if this was to be done, what if trans people were to be given access to women's spaces, and so on and so forth. And what, of course, this does, and we can see it in the data, is it reproduces the association of trans people, especially trans women, with predatory sexual behavior and abuse. At the same time, and in contradistinction to the discourses we see in almost every other context, there are arguments made frequently in the House of Commons that position transgender identity as a problem for traditional common, not just as a problem for traditional common sense or conservative values, inverted commas, which is there too, but that there is a trend of MPs that speak against trans rights by identifying in different ways, by identifying as a feminist, identifying as a lesbian, identifying as a gay man. These are all quotes from the corpus, and therefore posit transness as a threat to historically achieved and hard-won political and sexual freedoms. And therefore what happens in this kind of discourse is that it advances the gender binary as the only rational framework to operate within legally, socially, and politically. And that is very something which is reproduced quite significantly in parliamentary discourse. Moving on to media findings, I've rendered these findings quite starkly because the findings themselves are stark. I think it is fair to conclude that trans panic coverage, to give it a reasonably anodyne covering category, this coverage has become a key feature of right-wing media, which is a very expansive media arena, as we know, in the United Kingdom. Of course, to many observers of this may seem as something of an understatement. There are many recent studies also which have demonstrated the scale of increase in sensationalist and negative coverage. And while we see this in our research, there are some other dimensions that I'd like to add to the picture. The first of these, and one that I find quite significant, is that the idea of gender ideology is consistently normalized in right-wing media coverage. That is to say that an idea which is widely recognized as being highly partisan is normalized as something which simply exists and can be reported on without further qualification or without further explanation. So while The Guardian, for example, endured internal upheaval in 2020, prompted by staff protest at quote unquote anti-trans bias in comment and opinion pieces, in our data, the newspaper clearly treats the term gender ideology as ideologically loaded, and it is exclusively used in foreign news coverage and exclusively related to the transnational far right. We can contrast this with The Telegraph, which systematically naturalizes the term through its reporting in both news coverage and in opinion pieces. So, in contradistinction to The Guardian, The Telegraph exclusively reserves its usage of gender ideology for UK domestic reporting. In other words, it situates gender ideology as a domestic problem that needs to be reported on and tackled. And when it does this, it consistently links it, and the usage of it is consistently linked to trans issues. And in 95% of cases, the idea of gender ideology is used without inverted commas in The Telegraph, where in 100% of cases in The Guardian, it is used with inverted commas. So this gives us an extent to which it is normalized and naturalized within the coverage. So what this does in the Telegraph's case, by reserving the use of gender ideology to domestic reporting, is it positions it as an established political problem in education, social services and public spaces and institutions. And this is key to pushing the idea that there's a problem of trans activism in the UK context. So that is why we reach the following conclusion, that the extent of this saturation coverage of trans issues constitutes a form of media campaigning. The campaigning practices, again, if I take the example of The Telegraph, is underlined by the network of actors and organizations that consistently provide the source or focus of its coverage. For example, it's striking that half of the actors mentioned in stories that feature the term gender ideology are self-described gender critical actors who in many cases are actively involved in campaigns and organizations mobilized against transgender rights. To move on to controversy mapping, I think it's clear from the emergence of these patterns in the parliamentary and media data, it's clear why we felt compelled to take the debate over the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill as the controversy to be mapped. There's a number of different findings here that I'll try to pull out from the overall picture. The first is that in a sample, we sampled far wider than the three newspapers that we looked at in the media study. We took a sample of 50 opinion pieces from 22 news sources that were commenting on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. And in this sample of 50 opinion pieces, only 2 were written by writers who identified as trans. And so this is indicative across the political spectrum of how trans issues get written about and who speaks on trans issues, and the absence of trans people in speaking on their own issues and lives and rights. In the wider coverage, and particularly in the right-wing media that I've been referring to, the dynamics of the debate which took place around the reform bill was such that this debate worked through a kind of highly sensationalist coverage of issues that are then presented, but in being linked to the bill, are presented as indicating the nature and extent of the problem. So in other words, the coverage of the reform bill also provided a media space, to link it consistently to other so-called trans-related controversies, which were given intensive coverage during this period. In other words, conflating different issues into the idea that there's a significant problem which needs to be named and addressed. And in the network analysis we conducted, so we looked at what the different organizations and spokespeople, actors in general, who were quoted in news stories, and we mapped them in relation to each other. What we found is in the coverage as a whole, and then intensively in the right-wing media coverage, disproportionate media access was accorded to groups that self-identify as gender critical or anti-gender ideology, in comparison to trans-inclusive bodies and all other relative institutions. So in the sample of articles that were covering the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, this broke down to 70-30 in terms of groups which were named and groups which were quoted in the stories. And that is the final aspect of the UK study. And so I will pass to my colleague Cheryl, who will talk about the European Parliament.
Thank you, Gavin. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I will discuss our findings from the European Parliament study. Just get the slides to work. So the European Parliament is it's a powerful and important forum for political debate and decision-making in the European Union. Its members are directly elected by voters in all member states to represent citizens' interests regarding EU legislation and to oversee the democratic functioning of EU institutions. So just in terms of context, in terms of the presence and influence of radical right political groups in the European Parliament, we can trace those along the lines of two distinct groups. One is the European Conservative and Reformists, the ECR group, which at the time of our study had 63 MEPs from 19 parties and 15 countries across Europe. And the second group is the Identity and Democracy group, ID, which at the time of our study had 64 MEPs from 10 different countries. Opposing gender-related rights and freedoms has provided an important point of collaboration and community building for populist nationalist politics in the European Parliament. So it takes direct aim at fundamental rights set out in the European Parliament. In comparison to the results from the other national parliaments that my colleagues have summarised just now, the European Parliament is really marked differently in terms of the tone of contributions on gender-related issues. So they're frequently openly derogatory and hostile in terms of delivery. So our approach to doing this parliamentary research in the European Parliament was slightly different to the national case studies. We're working with a multilingual group of MEPs. Also, our corpus, it ended up incorporating 58 plenary debates collected from the period of 2015 to 2022. We gathered contributions from 172 MEPs from parties involved in anti-gender politics. And in terms of our data analysis, in order to code and to research languages that were all of the different languages in the European Parliament, we used a variety of methods, including AI transcription, which then was translation checked, and then we did manual coding from 58 debates, 1,183 speeches, and there were 409 items of coded content that we gathered, categorized, and then we submitted them into our initial analysis. So what we noticed was MEPs really played to home galleries, and the way that some of these messages from the forum of the European Parliament travelled was via social media. So 28 out of 32 actors that we sampled used footage of themselves in the European Parliament in anti-gender tweets from posts dated from November 1st to December 9th, 2022. So in terms of the Istanbul Convention, this really featured as the fulcrum around a lot of anti-gender discourse. So opposition to the Istanbul Convention still remains a significant site of anti-gender mobilizing. And in our corpus, this included conspiratorial ideas about the imposition of the Istanbul Convention. So the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, was framed as, quote unquote, a Trojan horse. So this is a quote from our corpus. So it's framed as a Trojan horse for gender ideology. And this accusation is used to distract discussion from violence against women. Quote unquote gender ideology is articulated as a rather contradictory cocktail. So at one point it's leftist values, then it's feminism, LGBT theory, it's both Marxism and imperialism. And it's always designed to attack European values. So everything from families to the Christian heritage of Europe. Opposing the convention's imposition is a way to call for the defense of sovereignty and traditional values against the European Union. So sovereignty and the work that sovereignty does here, it's linked to being able to perpetuate inequalities at national level by working to deny, for example, abortion rights and protections for LGBTIQ plus people. In terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, so the theme of SRHR, what we discovered was that actors from radical right parties often cite freedom of religion and conscience to refuse reproductive medical treatment on a spectrum from refusing or restricting access to contraception to banning access to safe abortions on a state level. So circling back to that sovereignty argument. So what we found was that anti-gender actors also deploy the idea of sovereignty to oppose abortion rights, and they accuse the Commission of a lack of respect for member states' legal frameworks. So abortion rights activists throughout the corpus are consistently framed in extremely negative ways. They're framed as perpetuating, quote unquote, a cult of death, and in some cases contributing to, quote unquote, a genocide. So we collected in our corpus debates around rainbow families, where queer families are framed as products of foreign and imported ideologies that threaten established national values. And this manifests in restriction to, fertility treatment for rainbow families, all the way down to legal recognition in terms of parents. So in terms of what we found in the corpus around gender mainstreaming and debates relating to gender mainstreaming, a common tactic for opposing gender-based initiatives that were tabled for debate and legislation is to argue that equality has come to mean minority issues that are being prioritized over heteronormativity and common sense values. So this is reiterated time and time again. And one quote was that the Commission has no tolerance for straight people and families. So this theme and argument of dismissal in a way constantly reiterates that gender-based initiatives are minority issues. Arguments against treating men and women equally or advocating for gender-inclusive language are frequently made by asserting that the natural complementarity of the sexes should trump any kind of gender mainstreaming. And they also frame these initiatives as artificial interventions that erase traditional culture, including European linguistic culture. So the very first mention of woke in our corpus anyway, was in October 2020, when the Commission had tabled a debate titled Gender Equality in EU's Foreign and Security Policy. And in this debate, the idea of gender mainstreaming was seen as linked to radical feminism identity politics, and intersectionality. So examples like this demonstrate the evidence the evidence of a practiced transnational repertoire of dismissal. So throughout our work, we've discovered really that this European Parliament corpus that we collated, it demonstrates a strong and highly organized cohort of anti-gender actors who use tactics of dismissal, disruption, and obstructionism to further national heteropatriarchal projects. So that concludes our European Parliament findings summary, and I will pass the baton over now for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our presenters. Just to remind you that if you do want to find a full set of findings, they are on our website under the What We Have Found link and tab. You can also sign up to our newsletter. We have some fascinating questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to them all, so apologies if we don't get to yours. But we'll start with the first question that came in, which is, which trans person would willingly accept an invitation to debate their experiences or to discuss their experiences with the likelihood that this becomes a debate? And Gavin, I think you're going to take the questions this afternoon. So I'll just pass that to you, and we might... I know Gavin's having some technical issues, so apologies for that.
Perhaps you can hear me, but maybe not see me. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Kath. Thank you for that question, and all the questions are really fascinating and acute ones, and I think I'll try to keep my answers brief so we can cover as many of them as possible. And apologies in advance if the answers are not as expansive as some of the issues raised demand and require, but I will restrict the way that I talk about them to what we see in the data and my interpretation of that in this instance. I think the issue raised here about debate is one which is obviously very acute when it comes to trans politics, but it's one which is acute in many ways when it comes to the representation and participation and sort of public presence and emancipation of minoritized people in general. That is to say, the idea of debate is often just taken as a shorthand, not just for exchange, but for a kind of ideal public discourse which expresses something intrinsically democratic. And of course, I think we know in many ways that the way that debate is talked about in the abstract and the way that debate actually occurs in terms of a somewhat messy and chaotic public sphere, but also one which is structured by an inequality of access to communicative resources and to legitimacy, which is deeply antagonistic, and where different forms of content circulate, where, to put it mildly, these are not forms of content that are looking for sort of rational, reasoned or dialogical engagement. So I think we know there's a massive difference between the way debate is spoken about and the way in which discourse circulates and people are positioned within that discourse in public. And I think we can see very clearly in the data, it would not be for me to say what trans people in general or activists should do in this context. But I think what we can see very, very clearly in the data is that much of the circulation of highly sensationalist and highly targeting material is done under the pretext of simply wanting to have an open and democratic debate or exercise freedom of speech on what are always described as controversial issues. But what that does, of course, and this is what we describe as hypervisibility, is consistently put trans people and trans issues under the spotlight in ways that are also very familiar from, of course, media studies of how racism, for example, operates, which is that there's a relationship between a sort of enforced invisibility, but then a hyper invisibility when people are problematized. And therefore what happens is that that people are formed into groups, and groups are homogenized as particular kinds of groups that have to answer to issues and agendas which are set by others. others and have to answer to issues and accusations which are leveled by others. So under these circumstances, and also under, I think, one of the things that I mentioned but would like to emphasize, the extent to which this kind of sensationalist coverage is actually would seem to be something of a commercial strategy. The extent of its reproduction and the intensification of its reproduction means we also need to look at it in those terms. Under those conditions, I would say that it is very, very, very difficult to try to think about how somebody can be fairly positioned in this debate. Again, not wanting to say anything about what trans people should do under these conditions, but I think hopefully by analysing the way in which this debate is stacked in all kinds of very, very alienating and sensationalizing and stereotyping and abjecting ways, we can think about what kinds of participation might be possible.
Thank you, Gavin. So to ask you the next question, could you extrapolate on the unlikely alliances between different actors? What kind of alliances form and become severed in these discussions? And how does the media contribute to the formation and dissolving of these alliances?
They really are complex and very good questions. I think this is an interesting question for a number of reasons. The first is that one of the things that we were very keen to center as a political and also analytical and methodological concern when we started looking at this material was not to try to assemble what it constitutes anti-gender politics today by following actors that have clear histories and traditions and biographies of activity in anti-gender politics. And the reason that we wanted to do this is that our intuitions, the two intuitions that we had around, first of all, the way in which anti-gender politics also provides a sort of repertoire which is circulating and can be sort of used by other actors. And also, of course, that if you simply follow particular actors, well, then you'll get back what those actors do. And we wanted also to be able to see the ways in which actors on other parts of the political spectrum were also implicated in or producing different kinds of anti-gender politics. So that was the way that we set out to try to avoid a kind of determinism of looking at the radical right and nationalist and conservative forces as the anti-gender actors and coming out with them solely at the other end. That said, I think the preponderance of results shows are about the actions of precisely those actors and the intensification of acts by those actors and the extent to which it has become increasingly important to them in a whole number of ways. And I think the European Parliament results are very indicative of that. That said, of course, some of these sort of stranger alliances, as we sort of vaguely call them, do emerge in the data. I think one of those, which is probably quite obvious from the UK findings that I presented, is the range of self-describing gender critical organizations, which in the UK context, as again many people will know, describe themselves and present themselves publicly and politically very much as feminist, socialist, other kinds of actors. So they themselves would obviously refute the idea that they are part of the radical right in any expansive sense, or that they are aligned with it. So I think that is the clearly the most obvious example of that as it emerges from the data.
Thanks, Gavin. So another question. So the underlying political functions served by anti-gender activists is quite clear in the case of Poland and Hungary, but for this questionnaire, it appears less clear in the case of the UK. So can you comment on what you think the political function of anti-gender movements are in the UK, what wider political, structural, economic aims or goals do, what they do, and do you think anti-gender movements are orientated towards in the UK context?
It's a really good question, and it's one that's very hard to dive into without, I suppose, reflecting a little on whether we expect movements to be functionalists. In other words, whether we can in every instance discern these underlying political, economic, or social functions of movements outside of what movements tell us about themselves. And what movements tell us about themselves is precisely what I need to work with. In other words, what comes up through the data. I would say that in terms of what we saw in the actor mapping, both in terms of the the groups that are quoted in, particularly in sort of coverage in the Telegraph, which was the main right-wing source that we looked at, but not exclusively. There are many and another complication here is what we consider movements as well, right? Because I think it's not entirely clear what are movements in the context of the UK. In other words, what is the relationship between activist journalism? What is the relationship between parts of the Conservative Party? And what is the relationship between particular groups? That's a whole other discussion we would have. But in the absence of time to do that, I would say that there are certain groups who have tied their in terms of the alliances that they have made. So, for example, we see a lot of alliance making with Policy Exchange, which of course is one of the key think tanks of the Conservative Party, or a certain part, the rightist flank of the Conservative Party. And Policy Exchange is a policy body which has been very, very central since a few years ago. They launched part of their campaign is called Biology Matters. They've been very, very central in prosecuting a kind of anti-trans politics in Britain. They're very close politically and also in network terms to the Daily Telegraph and other newspapers. Groups that have aligned themselves with Policy Exchange have in many ways aligned themselves with the end of how would you say, the end of term politics of the Conservative Party itself. And I would find it very, very difficult to extract anything further from that. But when it comes to thinking about movements and what they tell us about themselves, the movements that emerge through the data in the United Kingdom, for example, do not make reference to any other wider mission that I think we could read their mission around securing, as they see it, securing sex-based rights, securing consistency on the primacy of biology over gender, securing the primacy of that in education and in policy and in healthcare. These are the aims that they articulate, and there is very little else that is articulated that would allow me to speculate on, if you like, the wider function of those movements. But if we were having another kind of conversation outside of a data presentation, I might be able to speculate on that a little more. Sorry if that's not a very satisfying answer.
Thank you, Gavin. I think you're answering them beautifully. Just a quick technical question. Did we only look at UK Parliament or devolved parliaments, particularly Scotland?
Yeah, I saw that question, and I wouldn't like it to appear as if the methodology had, for example, deliberately excluded the Scottish Parliament, given precisely the key role the Scottish Parliament has played in the controversy mapping, which we did. This was simply a structural facet of the research. We looked at the national parliament in all cases, and of course, in the case of the United Kingdom, it's not quite a national parliament, obviously, but it is a parliament where there are, I think it's like 58, 59 MPs from Scotland. So there is obviously Scottish representation there. It would have been, I think, very interesting to look at the Scottish Parliament in more detail in the controversy mapping phase, but because we worked through media coverage back rather than the other way around, that wasn't possible. It was possible to see, just to say something about that, it was possible to see, though, some of the tensions in the Scottish Parliament being played out amongst Scottish delegates in Westminster during this period. I think one of the standouts there was the role that the debate about the gender recognition reform bill accorded to a party, for example, a very small party, the ALBA party, which has one MP, but who was omnipresent in the debates in this period for that reason, was able to use Westminster as a platform to talk about as this person saw it, to talk to the political chaos which they saw unfolding in the Scottish Parliament. But yeah, I think there's a lot more work to be done, both about the relationship of the parliaments, but also looking at the discourse in both parliaments during that particular period.
Thank you. And just another not so small or quick question. Are the neoliberal crises affecting the development and spread of gender ideologies and sexual politics discourses and practices?
Oh, I think again, I think that's a great question, which which prompts my at this point somewhat boring refrain that I need to talk mainly from the data, but I think it's a difficult one to answer methodologically also, because I think there's a sense in which I'm sure many of us are aware from the different ways in which we analyze politics, that the whatever we want to call it, but we could say the breakdown of the neoliberal consensus, the way in which that has involved a mix of sort of both state first and authoritarian turns in a range of different ways. The way in which that has driven, of course, not just support for, but a sort of gleeful but also differentiated mobilization on the radical and far right, which is a very capacious space these days. The way in which the mainstreaming of the far right has also involved, in many instances, the radicalization of the center right or traditional conservative right, convergence on the right, as David Renton called it. All of these kinds of conditions are clearly conditions under which particular populations are going to be picked out for victimization, are going to be picked out for abjection, are going to be held up as the populations which threaten the nation's integrity, or which can be blamed for the range of different social malaise or tensions or forms of inequality or stress and anxiety which are circulating in different polities. I think we know that's happening, but it's very difficult methodologically to make that leap from thinking about the kind of conjuncture which we can see in different contexts to the way that we see anti-gender politics manifest itself in the data that we have. Other than, of course, the ways in which, as we've seen, the anti-gender politics encompasses both a constantly renewed assault on certain rights and targets. So we obviously see quite a lot of targeting of feminist movements. We see quite a lot of targeting of LGBTIQ plus people, but also rights. We see the very visibility of LGBTIQ people taken as a form of activism, which threatens the sanctity of the nation. And then on top of that, of course, I won't go over the extent to which this targeting of trans people has been central to the data. I think the intensity and extent of all of those is probably more than the starting point for our answer as to how neoliberalism has intensified not just the production, but also the appeal of anti-gender politics in different ways. But again, sorry to be boring, but I can't go much further than that in speculating in terms of what we see in the data.
Thanks, Gavin. And this might also be beyond what we can say, but I think it's important just to address it, which is, did your research find any leads for potential transnational research between Europe and other regions?
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks also for saying that, Kat. The fact of me sort of boringly restricting them doesn't mean I'm really interested in all of these aspects, and as ones that we need to take on and think about in the next analytical phase. On this question, I can answer it, I think, much more empirically. Strangely not. There's both in terms of what manifests, or mainly in terms of what manifests in terms of actors. It's very clear that there are transnational relations, and it's very clear that there's sort of what we could call kind of transnational learning and exchange between groups, but it isn't always articulated. I think the place where we would see it most is in certain media data, in the Hungarian and Polish media data. There is a holding up of certain figures, global figures, as sort of indicative of sort of heroes of the anti-gender movement. So at a certain moment, obviously Donald Trump was very prevalent in the data, but then much more globally, Jair Bolsonaro is present, Narendra Modi is present as well. But there's very little mention of the kinds of movements that, of course, we associate with anti-gender movements in Central Africa or in Latin America or whatever it might be. And as I said, one of the other areas where coming from a slightly different perspective, where it was anti-gender politics was very clearly regarded as international and also extra-European was, as I said, in the Guardian's coverage of gender ideology. They saw that as something which was only to be associated with the European far right. So in this instance, there was quite a lot of coverage of Giorgia Meloni and her government as well, but also quite substantial discussion of other contexts, but really disproportionately focused on Brazil and India in this instance.
And I'm afraid we've...
And very rhetorical references rather than anything more substantive, I would say.
Apologies, Gavin.
Sorry,
we have run out of time, so I'm very sorry to the questions that are left in the inbox. Some really amazing questions, and thank you for being so engaged. And we really hope that you take up our offer to read all the findings in depth. There are various levels of findings from press releases all the way through to full hundreds of pages of documents, so that you can really get your teeth into it. Please do let us know if you want any further contact with us, so you can go onto the website and sign up for our newsletter, and we will update you on the next phases of the project, where we'll be releasing findings in the autumn, winter time, around our work package 2, which is listening. And we look forward to seeing you all then. If you want to get in touch with us, we also have a contact page on our website too. Thank you very, very much for coming.